Since 1989, parents have been pushing 18-year-olds to get credit cards so that they can build credit. Why do we start building credit? So that we can take out more and better debts. And how do we start building credit? Exclusively by taking on debts. Yeah, so today I want to talk about credit scores, specifically the 3 problematic requirements for building credit, the wacky and corrupt history of credit scores, and why, unfortunately, you still have to play this game even though it's all made up nonsense, because if you don't take out any debts, then you won't have any credit, and then you won't be able to do things like get a loan on a car, take out a mortgage, start a business, or even get a job in some cases. It's a lot to go over, so please be sure to like this video and subscribe if you are new, and let's get right into it. So what raises your credit score? Well, a lot of things, but an entire third of your credit score comes from your credit utilization ratio. This is the amount of credit that you are actively using in relation to what you have available to use. So if you have a credit card with a $1,000 limit and you currently have an outstanding balance of $500 on that credit card, then your credit utilization ratio would be 50%. And then your ratio will start to improve your credit score if you keep it under 30%. So with that $1,000 limit, so long as your outstanding balance is at $299 or less, your credit score will start to go up. Now, there are only 2 ways to improve your ratio. The first way is to just use a less amount of the credit you have available, like I mentioned before, but the other way is to actually increase your credit limit. Now, in theory, banks increase the credit limits of people who are good and responsible with their credit. In practice, banks will raise the credit limit of literally anyone who asks, and most banks even have a policy of increasing the credit limit for all of their customers every single year. Now, this can obviously be a problem in a country where the average person has $6,500 worth of credit card debt, a number that skyrockets past $9,000 for 43 to 59-year-olds. And in a country where monthly take-home pay is somewhere between $2,000 and $3,000 a month for the average worker, that means statistically, the average American has 3 times their monthly take-home pay in credit card debt alone. Yikes. And yet we actively encourage people to increase their credit limit every year so that they can improve their utilization ratio and then get better interest rates on more and bigger debts. Oh God, I'm starting to sound like Dave Ramsey. Now, you might be saying, great, all I need to do is take out a credit card and then not use it. That way I can have a debt utilization rate of 0%, right? No. If your CUR is 0%, then that will not improve your credit score. Meaning that if you want to build credit, you have to utilize a percentage of the amount available to you, somewhere between 1% and 30%, which is probably fine for a lot of people, but is absolutely a psychological trap for the average American who does not necessarily perceive credit card debt as money that they have to pay back when they use it in the short term. Now, the next biggest slice of your credit score pie is payment history. What your payment history is recurring payments that you make on credit-based debts. When you make those payments, your score goes up. When you don't make those payments, after 30 days, your score goes down. But what's more interesting than what your payment history is what your payment history isn't. None of your normal people bills are considered part of your payment history. Rent? No. Utilities? No. Water, garbage, medical bills? No, no, and no. None of the normal people bills that you have to pay every month are counted as part of your credit history and don't actually improve your credit score if you pay them on time. The only exception to this is if you don't make those payments and end up getting sent to collections, which does lower your credit score. Which is honestly a bummer because this actually happened to me recently without my knowing. So I grew up in Nevada, and one day I was like, hey, I have pale skin. I should go in and get scanned for skin cancer. So I went to the dermatologist. They sent some samples to a lab. I paid the dermatologist for a visit. And then a few weeks later, they called me and were like, hey, you don't have skin cancer. Hallelujah. But then 13 months later, I found out that that lab that did the biopsy charged me and sent that bill straight to collections over a year later without ever telling me that I was being charged for that lab work. I had to look this up, and apparently this is legal. Companies can just send you to collections for medical bills without even telling you that you have a bill. Greatest country on earth. The next biggest portion of your credit score is a length of history on specific debts. This is pretty straightforward. It's just how long you've been making payments on a certain debt. But despite how straightforward this is probably the most problematic thing that impacts your credit score. The reason for that is because your age of debts will actually go down anytime that you pay off a loan or you close out a credit card. So I've had a credit card for 10 years now that I actually don't use anymore at all. But if I were to say, hey, I've had this piece of plastic just sitting around for 10 years, I should close this out, what would end up happening is that my average age of payment on that debt would go down 10 years, and my credit score would probably drop dramatically as a result. And so not only would I be punished for closing out that credit card, but I'm also actively being punished for not using that credit card because my credit utilization rate on it is 0%. And so once you take on any debt in America, you start to get punished for not taking on more debt, which is fine for some people who are smart and responsible. But like we saw before, there are a lot of Americans who aren't smart and responsible with debt, but not you guys. No, people who watch the Urgently Firing channel are smart, so subscribe. Now let's dive into the weird and kind of corrupt history of credit scores. Even though the credit score we know today started only 7 years before I was born, attempts to start standardizing credit began in 1841. Now, loans have always been around. One of the fastest ways to make money in this world is just to borrow money from somebody else and then use it to make even more money than you otherwise would. So instead of spending, say, a year selling 500 baskets in your small village, you could take out a loan to buy a cart, go into the big city, and then sell 500 baskets a day. Then you just pay interest back on that loan that you had, and both parties end up making more money than they had before. It's a win-win. But loaning out money has always had an inherent risk. How do you know that the borrower's business won't fail? How do you know that they're not just going to take your money and run? Well, historically, you did that through figuring out whether or not they were trustworthy. You would talk to their neighbors and their customers, and you would say, hey, this is the type of person who seems like they can run a business, and they're the type of person with enough moral compass that they'll probably pay me back. And if they didn't pay you back, you would just break their kneecaps and burn down their farm. Easy, right? Well, that was until 1841, when the US passed the Bankruptcy Act, basically giving legal protections to people who did not or could not pay back their debts. And that created an insane additional risk for anyone lending out money, because now the person in debt to you could file for bankruptcy, and then they, their company, or their loved ones would have no obligation to pay you back. And so 1841 marks the beginning of attempts to create credit scores. So naturally, banks wanted to be a little more scientific about how they determined creditworthiness, so they decided to do that through mass surveillance. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, so-called credit raters would commit acts of corporate espionage and insane invasions of privacy in order to determine someone's creditworthiness. This information would then be compiled into literal files and sent off to New York City, where banks and other companies could then request those reports on specific people. Unsurprisingly, credit ratings were extremely biased against people that the credit raters did not like. And so women, Jewish, and non-white Americans were given disproportionately bad credit ratings throughout those centuries. This created what's called redlining, where entire neighborhoods or entire groups of people stopped being offered financial services because credit raters determined them to be too high risk. Racism notwithstanding, this was just an insane invasion of Americans' privacy, and created situations where if you made a mistake in the business world, you were basically never given a second chance. finance. In 1936, Time magazine did a report on the National Association of Credit Men, an organization of 20,000 credit raters whose job was to analyze business ledgers and people's personal character in order to decide how banks should give them credit. These credit men would do totally normal things, like sing songs in order to open up their meetings, take pilgrimages to Rockefeller sites, and participate in a fraternal society called the Royal Order of Zebras, a society that is extremely difficult to find information about and really only appears in random news clippings, obituaries, or rich old men's LinkedIn pages. And so, to highlight the problematic nature of this group, Time magazine did a report on the credit ratings of a woman named Mrs. John Jones, a woman who was probably a prostitute in Chicago trying to escape to LA to create a better life for herself. Upon moving to Los Angeles and trying to buy a house, start a business, or do anything else related to credit, people in LA could simply reach out to Chicago and get a credit rating report on Mrs. John Jones' personal character. And upon receiving that report, they would find that Mrs. John Jones was a widow of 40 with no children, enjoyed no visible means of support, lived in swank apartments, entertained unsavory characters, was late with her rent, lived in Chicago for only 2 years, and was leaving with $500 of unpaid bills. Whether or not Mrs. John Jones was real is kind of up for debate, but the truth of the matter was that these personal reports that combined personal character with somebody's financial situation were the norm in America until the 1970 Fair Credit Reporting Act. This legislation made it illegal to add information about personality, habits, or health to somebody's credit report, with the hopes that this would make consumer reporting more accurate, fair, and private. In fact, this was one of the first big data privacy laws ever passed, and it set a powerful precedent moving into the 20th century when we started to store reports on individuals onto computers where they were there more permanently. This new regulation brought new credit reporting companies into power and new credit scoring systems with them. In the years that followed, one data analytics company out of Montana, namely the Fair Isaac Company, or FICO, rose out above the rest, which debuted the first universal and standardized credit scores in 1989, which takes us to today. At scale, credit scores are a system that helps the rich and hurts the poor. The more money and financial literacy you have, the more likely that you're going to have a better credit utilization ratio, a better payment history, and a better length of credit, meaning you will have better interest rates on bigger loans for things like cars, houses, and starting a business. Whereas missed payments using more of your credit card or having debts for a shorter amount of time will give you a lower credit score, meaning you will have worse rates on those loans, and you will end up having to pay significantly more money in interest over time than somebody with the exact same loan who has a better credit score than you. All that being said, credit reports today are less bad than what we had before. Credit reports are now based off of personal finances and technically not things like your race, your romantic partners, or what your neighbors think of you. And yet, even though the credit score is an inherently flawed and kind of corrupt system, we still have to be smart about our credit utilization ratio, our payment history, and our length of credit. Because if we don't, we just won't have any upward socioeconomic mobility.